I didn't come to Windmir Bay looking for anyone. After everything I'd lost, I just wanted silence. But then he was there, quiet, steady, watching the world like he'd already lived 1,000 lives. I didn't know it then, but meeting him would change everything. There was a quiet that lived in the town of Windmere Bay, the kind that wrapped around everything like a soft blanket, unassuming, weightless, and patient. Miles Whitaker felt it the moment he arrived, stepping out of his car with a bag slung over his shoulder and the faint scent of salt and pine in the air. It wasn't the kind of silence that asked questions. It simply accepted. The house had been untouched for months. His uncle's absence left it in a state of paused life. Books half finished on a nightstand, a forgotten coffee cup near the window, blankets still draped over the couch like someone had only just risen to make a call. Miles moved through the space with deliberate care, brushing dust off familiar surfaces, not entirely sure if he was returning somewhere or escaping something else. His days began with coffee and the creak of floorboards beneath his feet. He didn't fill the silence with music or television. There was enough noise in his head to keep him company. The routine became a rhythm. Breakfast in the same chair, slow walks by the shore, watching the wind shift the tide. He first noticed Calder Ruiz on a Tuesday, though had probably passed him before without realizing. Calder had a presence that didn't demand attention, but held it once it was given. He worked at the old antique store near the edge of town, the one with chipped paint and a bell that jingled softly when the door opened. Miles had entered looking for nothing in particular and left with an old lantern he didn't need, just to feel something. Calder had nodded at him, a quiet acknowledgement that felt deeper than it should have. There was no small talk, no drawn-out smiles, just a kind of stillness that mirrored Miles's own. In the following days, their paths continued to cross, at the small grocery store by the docks at the same bench facing the sea. They never spoke more than a few words, but something shifted each time. A recognition, perhaps, or maybe just two men carrying similar weights, finding an odd comfort in proximity. One morning, Miles sat on the back porch with a notebook resting on his knee, though he hadn't written in weeks. The pages remained mostly blank, save for a few scribbled thoughts. He watched the sky stretch over the water, its colors muted by the fog. It reminded him of his own emotions, present but subdued. He thought about the years behind him, about the life that had gradually collapsed under the weight of unspoken grief, unmet expectations, and a silence that had turned from peaceful to suffocating. Coming here hadn't been about healing. He wasn't naive enough to believe a change in scenery could rewrite his history. But maybe, just maybe, it could soften the edges. When he saw Calder again, it was under the dripping trees near the trailhead, both of them soaked through from the rain that had come without warning. Calder held an umbrella he wasn't using, letting the drops hit his shoulders as he stood beside a bench, unmoving. Miles stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to speak or continue walking. Calder didn't look up. He didn't need to. There was a shared understanding in the way they existed side by side, like two songs playing in the same key but never quite blending. They were strangers, yes, but the kind who felt strangely known. Back at the house, Miles dried off and returned to his notebook. Still blank. Still waiting. He thought about the people he had left behind, the ones who never really saw him. Not fully. He wondered what it meant to be seen. Truly seen. Not for your job title. Not for your politeness. Not for the life you built to keep the world from asking questions, but for what you carried in your silences. The days passed, as they often did in Windmir Bay, without urgency. The town moved like breath. Even the clocks seemed unbothered by precision. And in that stillness, Miles began to notice the way his own body responded. How his shoulders eased without permission. How his sleep grew deeper. How the tightness in his chest stopped fighting so hard to stay. There was a comfort in knowing that no one expected anything from him here. And yet, every time Calder's shadow passed near his own, something stirred. A question, perhaps, or a quiet invitation. He didn't know what it meant. He wasn't trying to name it. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to feel it. The days in Windmere Bay settled into something resembling a rhythm, not rigid but steady, like the soft tide that swept across the shore and retreated without needing to explain itself. Miles found comfort in repetition. Morning coffee. Walks down to the docks. Evenings on the porch as the sky bled into a soft gray. It was predictable, safe, and yet not stagnant. Things were shifting. Subtly, quietly. He began to frequent the antique store more often, not out of necessity, but because Calder was there. They rarely spoke beyond a few exchanged words. But it was in those moments, the way Calder would glance up when Miles entered, the still pause in the air between them, that something took root. A silent current passed between them, and neither seemed eager to interrupt it with small talk. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Miles lingered by the back shelves of the shop, fingers brushing against the spines of old books and frames that seemed to hold other people's memories. Calder moved around the space with quiet purpose, never in a rush, as though he was part of the very structure. His presence was grounding, and without meaning to, Miles began to breathe easier in that space. It wasn't attraction in the traditional sense, not loud or all-consuming. It was something slower, deeper. It lived in moments. The way Calder would rest his hand briefly on the edge of a counter, the slight tilt of his head when listening, the rare curve of his mouth when something quietly amused him. These details imprinted themselves on Miles like fingerprints on glass. Later that week, their paths crossed again at the local bookstore. Miles was thumbing through a collection of essays when Calder passed behind him and paused. He didn't say anything, just stood there for a moment, as though considering whether to speak. Then, just as quietly as he'd appeared, he continued on. But in that suspended second, something had shifted. The silence between them no longer felt accidental. It felt intentional. That night, Miles couldn't sleep. He found himself on the porch again, watching the shadows of trees sway under the moonlight. His thoughts weren't chaotic, just persistent. He tried to name what was blooming between them, but language failed him. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. It wasn't desire in the usual sense. There was too much reverence in it for that. What he felt was something softer, less defined, like the early edges of trust. The next morning, a small package rested on the front step. It was a book, worn but intact, with a simple note inside, for the quiet nights. See, Miles turned the pages slowly, almost afraid to breathe too loudly, as if the moment might dissolve. He didn't need to wonder who had left it. He knew. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a question. It was simply a gesture, and yet it spoke volumes. It said, "I see you. I notice you. I care enough to leave something behind." And Miles felt something loosen inside him, something that had been wound tight for years. Over the next few days, they began to share small fragments of themselves. Not full stories, just pieces. Calder mentioning the town he'd left behind, Miles quietly nodding without offering anything in return. There was no pressure, no demand for reciprocity. It was more like an unspoken agreement. We reveal when we're ready. One evening, the two found themselves walking along the bluff trail that overlooked the sea. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the scent of impending rain clung to the air. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The sound of their footsteps, the distant call of seabirds, and the slow crash of waves below became their language. It was a conversation made of presence. At one point, their hands brushed, just barely. An accident, maybe, but neither pulled away. Miles felt the contact like a spark that didn't burn, but warmed. He didn't look at Calder. He didn't need to. He just kept walking, and Calder walked beside him, neither of them breaking the silence. It was enough. When they parted ways that evening, there was no goodbye, no lingering glance, just a mutual understanding that the space between them had changed, grown smaller, more intimate. Back at the house, Miles finally wrote something in the notebook that had sat untouched for weeks. Just a few lines. Nothing poetic or profound, but honest. He didn't know where this was going. He didn't even know if it was going anywhere. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone in the unknown. The rhythm of Windmir Bay had settled into Miles like the slow pull of tide. His days unfolded with a softness that felt almost foreign. There were still long stretches of silence, but they no longer felt hollow. The silence had texture now, depth, memory, possibility. Calder became a part of that rhythm without ever forcing his way in. They didn't plan their meetings, but they happened. At the market, by the docks, in the quiet corners of town that only locals seem to find. And each time, their conversations deepened, not in length but in weight. A look could carry a full sentence. A pause could say what neither dared to voice. One late afternoon, Miles wandered into the antique store without meaning to. Rain pattered against the windows, a constant murmur that filled the space with quiet music. Calder stood behind the counter, his hands wrapped around a mug, steam curling up toward his face. He looked up and offered a faint smile. No words were exchanged, and yet the silence between them felt warm. Familiar. Miles walked slowly through the store, stopping to run his hand along a wooden chest. The grain of the wood, worn and imperfect, reminded him of something he couldn't name. Calder joined him after a while, setting the mug down beside them, and for several minutes they stood side by side, neither speaking. It was enough. In that moment, Miles realized how rarely in his life he had been allowed to simply exist beside someone else, without pressure to perform or impress. With Calder, he didn't feel observed or judged. He felt seen, and it frightened him in a way he couldn't explain, because being seen meant being known, and being known meant risking something. Later that evening, back in the quiet of the house, Miles replayed the day's moments in his mind, not for analysis, but for comfort. He had begun to collect them like sea glass, tiny remnants of something once sharp, now softened by time. He didn't know what they meant. He only knew they mattered. The next few days passed in a soft haze. The town held its breath beneath overcast skies, and Miles found himself leaning into the stillness. He read more, walked longer, let the silence speak to him. And always there was Calder, never too close, never far. A presence just within reach. One morning, Miles awoke earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, a faint silver lining the horizon. He wrapped himself in a blanket and stepped outside. The air was crisp, and the world was silent, as if waiting for permission to begin. Without knowing why, he started walking, down the familiar path toward the shore, through the quiet streets, past the closed cafe windows. He didn't expect to find Calder there, sitting on the bench that faced the water. But he wasn't surprised, either. Calder looked up, his expression unreadable in the dim light, then shifted slightly to one side, wordlessly offering space. Miles sat beside him, and they watched the sky together as it began to wake. The sun rose slowly, cautiously, painting the edges of the world in soft gold. It was the kind of moment that didn't require commentary, the kind that lived in silence. As the light grew stronger, Calder reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object. A pocket compass, old and worn, the glass slightly scratched. He turned it in his hand for a moment, then passed it to Miles without a word. Miles held it carefully, watching the needle tremble, then settle. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. The gesture said everything. Direction, trust, a way forward. After a while, they rose together and walked back through the waking town. Their steps matched in rhythm, quiet but purposeful. And though no promises were spoken, something had been exchanged, intangible but undeniable. Back at the house, Miles placed the compass on the windowsill where the morning light could reach it. It felt like an anchor, a symbol of something unnamed but growing. He stood there for a long time, watching the light shift and let the weight of the moment settle into him. He didn't know where this path would lead. He wasn't even sure he wanted to know, but he no longer felt like he was walking it alone, and in that there was peace. The days grew shorter. Shadows stretched longer across the roads of Windmir Bay, and the air carried that unmistakable edge of change. Miles noticed it not only in the trees beginning to rust at the tips, but in the way he and Calder moved around each other, carefully, intentionally, as if something fragile had formed between them and neither wanted to be the one to break it. They still spoke in fragments. A shared glance, a faint smile, the occasional touch of hands when something was passed from one to the other. But beneath those small gestures was a quiet, mounting pressure, one that neither of them addressed directly, but both felt growing steadily with each passing moment. One evening, the the power flickered out. A storm had rolled in fast, swallowing the sun and bringing with it a dense, oppressive silence. Miles lit candles throughout the house and wrapped himself in a sweater, letting the low hum of the wind rattle the windows. He found himself standing by the compass on the windowsill again, watching the needle drift lazily in place. He didn't expect a knock at the door, but when it came, 3 soft taps, uncertain but present. He didn't hesitate. Calder stood there, his hair damp from the rain, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn jacket. He didn't explain why he came. He didn't need to. Miles stepped aside, and Calder entered as though it were something they'd done 100 times before. They sat in the living room, the storm outside, now a soft percussion behind the walls. The candlelight cast flickering shadows across the room, and their silence stretched, not awkward but deliberate. Miles felt it in his chest. The question, the uncertainty, the trembling line between comfort and longing. He didn't want to ruin what they'd built, whatever it was. But he also couldn't deny that something inside him had shifted. Quietly, yes, but permanently. Calder leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as if trying to find answers there. The light caught the edge of his profile, revealing a calmness that only deepened the ache inside Miles. They were close, closer than they'd ever been, but it still felt like a canyon separated them. A canyon built not of distance, but of fear. There was a moment when their eyes met, and the air between them thickened, not with urgency, but with meaning. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the kind of moment that demanded courage, but neither of them seemed ready to cross the line. Eventually, Calder stood. He walked to the window and looked out into the rain, his hands braced on the frame. His reflection in the glass looked older somehow, tired but not broken. Miles joined him after a moment, standing just far enough away to give space, but near enough to offer presence. They stood there together, 2 silhouettes framed by candlelight and stormlight. And in that silence, something settled, an understanding, a shared hesitation, a fragile hope. Calder turned toward him, not fully, just enough to let his shoulder brush against Miles's. The touch was faint, almost accidental, but they both stilled. Miles could feel his heartbeat in his throat, not racing, just steady and loud. He didn't reach out. He didn't speak. He only stood there, grounded by the weight of all the things left unspoken. When Calder finally turned back toward the door, Miles followed without question. They exchanged no goodbyes, no explanations, just the soft closing of the door and the echo of presence lingering in the air long after he was gone. That night, Miles didn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the rain, watching shadows ripple across the ceiling and thinking about all the moments that had led here. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had. In the morning, the storm had passed, but the air still carried its memory. Miles made coffee, wrapped himself in a blanket, and watched the sun rise from the porch. The compass sat beside him, its needle resting steady now. He thought about Calder's presence, how it had become part of his days, part of his stillness. He didn't know where they stood, or what came next, but he knew that something had been named in the silence between them, even if no words had been spoken. And for now, that was enough. Autumn took hold of Windmir Bay with quiet certainty. The trees along the coast turned brittle gold and soft rust, and the scent of wood smoke drifted through the air. Everything seemed to slow, as though the whole town was catching its breath before winter. Miles moved through the days with a sense of calm that felt earned, like something gently reclaimed rather than forced. He and Calder continued their quiet orbit around each other, never forced, never rushed. There was an ease to their presence now, a familiarity that required no explanation. They didn't need to label it. It simply was. And it grew in the quiet spaces between words and glances, in the routines that became rituals, in the stillness that no longer felt empty. One Saturday afternoon, Miles found Calder waiting on the bench near the bluff. The sea stretched endlessly beyond them, blue-gray and shimmering. Calder didn't speak when Miles approached. He simply offered a place beside him, and Miles sat without hesitation. They watched the waves together, letting the rhythm of the tide speak for them. Somewhere behind them, the town continued to hum with life, but it felt distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was this quiet, this pause in time where nothing needed to be resolved or understood. Calder reached in his coat and pulled out a small notebook, its corners bent, the spine worn soft. He passed it to Miles, who opened it slowly. Inside were sketches, simple, rough lines of the sea, the lighthouse, the antique shop, the house on the hill. But in between the landscapes, there were pages filled with pieces of Miles, his silhouette on the porch, the curve of his profile in candlelight, his hands wrapped around a mug in the early morning chill. Miles turned the pages with care, each one revealing something Calder had seen and captured without ever speaking of it. It wasn't about artistry. It was about observation, about attention, about being seen when no one else was looking. He closed the notebook and held it gently in his lap. There were no words that could carry the weight of what he felt. So he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. That evening, back at the house, Calder stayed. It wasn't planned. There was no ceremony to it. They simply existed in the same space as the sky turned from amber to navy. Miles lit a fire in the hearth. Calder prevetea. They sat on opposite sides of the couch, legs stretched out, the flicker of flames reflecting in their eyes. Hours passed like minutes. Sometimes they spoke, quiet memories, fragments of their lives before Windmir, but mostly they let the silence speak. It was their language now. At one point, Calder's hand found Miles's on the couch cushion between them. No movement, no pressure, just presence. And in that gentle, wordless gesture, Miles felt something settle inside him, something that had been restless for far too long. He looked at Calder then, really looked at the lines around his eyes, the softness in his mouth, the steadiness in his gaze. There was no fear there, no hesitation, just a quiet trust and something deeper that neither of them dared name, but both knew was real. They didn't speak of the future. They didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, life continued. The days grew colder, the nights longer, and yet everything felt warmer somehow. Miles found peace in the repetition. In the walks to the shore, the dinners shared in silence, the books left open on the porch swing, waiting to be resumed. They remained two men who had found something rare in the stillness. Not passion that burned bright and brief, but something steadier, something that could last. The compass remained on the windowsill. The sketches stayed on the nightstand. The silence between them deepened, not in absence, but in meaning. One evening, as the first snow dusted the rooftops of Windmir Bay, Miles stepped out onto the porch. Calder followed, and together they stood watching the flakes drift down, catching in their hair and melting on their sleeves. They didn't speak. They didn't have to, because sometimes the most powerful kind of love lives not in what is said, but in what is shared, in the quiet, in the staying, in the space between two people who no longer feel the need to hide. And still they stayed.